Alright everyone, today we're going to be talking about Unlearning Economics and his recent video, Value. Specifically, I'm going to be responding to his critique of Marxist economics, which is what most of his video is focused on. In this video, we're going to be covering a lot of stuff. We're going to be talking about the labor theory of value and the criticisms Unlearning Economics has of it. My goal is to be as simple and straightforward as possible. I'm just going to highlight the criticisms Unlearning Economics makes and then respond to those criticisms as clearly as possible. However, before I actually respond to Unlearning Economics' arguments, I first want to define the labor theory of value and clear up some common misconceptions. Unlearning Economics also defines the LTV, however, I want to go a little more in depth. If you want to skip straight ahead to me refuting Unlearning Economics' arguments, then just skip to this timestamp. The labor theory of value states that the average price of a commodity should be roughly proportional to the socially necessary or the average labor time employed in its production. This phrase, socially necessary labor time, might seem complicated, but really it just means average labor time. On average, how many hours of labor it takes for society to produce something. In other words, the harder things are to make, the more valuable they are. The LTV predicts that market prices should be proportional to labor values in nearly every sector of a capitalist economy. The only exceptions should be natural monopolies like oil, whose profits are explained by the Ricardian theory of rent, but that's a story for another day. The labor theory of value, contrary to popular belief, isn't actually the invention of Marx. It dates back to the 14th century Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun, and was carried by the classical economists before Marx, notably by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The LTV was the consensus within economics until the late 19th century, when it was discarded in favor of marginal utility for political reasons. Marginal utility says that the value of commodities is determined by subjective consumer preferences, as represented by these supply and demand curves, where the intersection of these two curves determines price. No empirical evidence refuting the LTV was ever actually produced. It was the rise of socialism and the labor movement that convinced the mainstream economists that the theory was just too politically dangerous. As an aside, Unlearning Economics makes this inaccurate claim.
One old interpretation is that labor value determines price. Smith and Ricardo were more wedded to this idea than Marx was. For Marx, labor value is determined not by the time an individual spends laboring, but by something called socially necessary labor time.
This is not true. Smith and Ricardo didn't believe that upfront labor time determined the value of commodities. They also thought it was average labor time. David Ricardo wrote,
"The value of a commodity, or the quantity of any other commodity for which it will exchange, depends on the relative quantity of labor which is necessary for its production, and not on the greater or less compensation which is paid for that labor."
There are important differences between the LTV of Marx and the LTV of Smith and Ricardo, but this is not one of them. I don't think it's too important for the purposes of this video to fully describe what the differences are. However, I will highlight the most significant difference. Marx's version of the LTV includes the theory of exploitation. To put it as concisely as possible, Smith and Ricardo thought that wages were just payment for labor, and thus there was no exploitation in the relationship between capitalist and worker. Marx, however, argued that wages are payment to reproduce labor power, or the capacity to work. and that during the working day, workers produce value above the value of their wage, and that this additional surplus value is appropriated by capitalists as profit. Unlearning Economics does sort of understand the Marxist theory of exploitation, but I think he somewhat misrepresents it.
Marx's theory of exploitation assumes that labour values underlie capitalism. The fact that labour is not paid its true value underlies the charge of exploitation of workers.
This is not quite correct. Marxists don't actually believe that workers should be paid the full value produced by their labor in a working day. The mere extraction of a surplus does not constitute exploitation. The charge of exploitation comes from the fact that capitalists appropriate surplus labor time for themselves, and workers have no say in the matter. The surplus product is not controlled by the workers, either directly or indirectly. Instead, it's controlled by unaccountable private capitalists. The Marxist definition of exploitation is, essentially, the undemocratic appropriation of the fruits of someone's labor. The relationship between employer and employee is not the only form. Landlord rents are another form of exploitation, as is charging interest on loans, as are copyright royalties. The political message is not workers should be paid the full value of their labor. The political message is labor should be the only legitimate form of income unless someone has special needs, and any surplus product should be democratically controlled. Next, I want to explain Marxist value theory a little more closely. There's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding surrounding this subject, and I want to make sure everything is clear. In particular, terms like these are very often misinterpreted, so let's go at them one by one. First, use value. Use value refers to the property of a commodity that satisfies some human need or want. Often you'll see the sophomore critique that useless things lack value no matter the labor that went into them. But things need to have a use value, that is, they need to satisfy a human need or want to have any value at all. Next, exchange value. Exchange value is the proportion in which a particular commodity needs to be exchanged with another for there to be an exchange of equivalence. It's defined by the embodied socially necessary labor time within commodities. For example, if a pack of eggs has a labor value of, say, 1 hour, and a wooden chair has a labor value of 2 hours, then 1 chair could exchange for 2 packs of eggs. 1 chair is worth 2 packs of eggs, so to speak. And finally, I want to tackle a very crucial conceptual distinction: abstract and concrete labor. Abstract labor refers to the general human capacity to do work, disassociated from any particular form of work. It's the recognition that one single person is usually capable of doing an extremely wide range of tasks. Humans are, in effect, universal machines involved in every production process. Abstract labor is something unique to humans. Horses, for example, can plow fields and transport people, but there's not much else they can do. There is no horse labor in the abstract. Machines can do specific tasks, but they don't have the abstract capacities of humans, and they're dependent on human inputs. As we'll see in the next section, abstract labor is essential to explaining why only human labor creates value. Abstract labor is what makes human labor special. Concrete labor, meanwhile, is just the specific forms of human work, like cooking, teaching, etc. Before we go further, you might be wondering, why is labor the source of value? How does that make any sort of sense? Unlearning Economics is wondering the same thing.
I'm going to ask what I hope is a disarmingly simple question. Why does only labour create value? This is an assumption which is treated as an irrefutable truth. But if constant capital, C if you remember, creates surplus value, then the whole theory falls apart. I was recently at a London grammar gig in Crystal Palace. There were massive speakers which multiplied the volume of the band, probably by like 10 decibels or something. You've got to give me a good reason these speakers did not generate surplus value. Without them, the gig would have been pretty quiet and nobody would have gone. The same is true of the band, of course, but why is labour special? You can easily do this with any commodity. Ellerman uses the example of apples. Suppose that the true value of 10 apples is equal to 1 bushel of corn. Yet in reality, the person selling has to pay 15 apples for 1 bushel of corn. As with the labour theory of value, the actual amount paid differs from the underlying value. This example is obviously ridiculous, but its basic setup is no different from Marxist theories.
So, Unlearning Economics appears to think that Marxists have no explanation for why labor is the source of value. He thinks that it's just a politically motivated assertion we make, but never try to justify, to the point that you can replace labor with anything, like apples, and the theory remains just as valid. However, there is indeed an explanation within modern Marxist economics for why human labor uniquely creates value. Before I go further, I want to specify the tradition of Marxism I'm drawing from. I am drawing from the econophysics tradition. Econophysics uses methods from physics and statistical mechanics in the study of political economy. The econophysics approach was pioneered by two Marxist mathematicians, Emanuel Farjeon and Moshe Machover, in their 1983 book Laws of Chaos. Econophysics helps to explain why human labor is ultimately the source of value. It all comes down to the role that human labor plays in the material reproduction and operation of an economy. In this regard, human labor is in fact quite special. Recall the concept of abstract labor. Humans have abstract capacity. One single person is usually capable of performing an extremely wide range of jobs. Humans have a special capacity to learn new skills and apply those skills, much more effectively than any other species on Earth, or any machine we have yet created. This abstract capacity of ours means that human labor ends up functioning as the universal input. Human labor is involved in every production process. It's the universal resource. This also means that human labor is the ultimate constraint on production. But in addition to being universal, human labor is also scarce. Producing new workers is hard and time-consuming. The universality of labor, combined with its scarcity, means that for a capitalist economy to successfully reproduce itself and meet ever-changing demand, human labor must be allocated highly efficiently, much more so than any other input. Labor values prove to be quite useful at achieving this. If prices are proportional to labor values, demand can meet supply. This is especially critical because it allows the capital stock to be replenished, so that an economy doesn't shrink and collapse. David Zachariah explains this in a paper from 2006.
Labor is a universal but scarce resource. During any given period of time, there is a limited amount of person-hours available in production, which constrains the feasible consumption pattern. This imposes a practical necessity to allocate it in various branches of production in order to meet changing social demands. Thus, determining demand in terms of labor becomes functionally useful in order to organize and allocate labor with some degree of efficiency. In economies governed by market exchange, a large number of producers are integrated indirectly via purchases and sales. These economies face the same problematic of organizing and allocating social labor, but have to solve it by the mechanisms of market exchange. If we interpret the market price of a good or service as a stochastic signal, the LTV suggests that its labor value is a deterministic component underlying the noise. This implies a control mechanism in that deviations between market prices and prices proportional to labor values, caused by supply and demand discrepancies, will lead to counteracting adjustments in output.
But hold on a cotton-picking minute. We are coming back to the same problem we had with marginal productivity theory. We have no measure of the exchange value other than the market. We also have no measure of the value of socially necessary labour time other than wages. We're back to the circularity of theories which attempt to explain prices via prices.
Unlearning Economics makes two claims here. We have no measure of the exchange value other than the market, and we have no measure of the value of socially necessary labor time other than wages. Both of these claims are just two different ways of framing the broader argument that he's making here, that labor values aren't measurable. This argument is very easy to refute. It's true that most studies correlating prices with labor values have used wages to proxy labor values, but it's just demonstrably false to say that labor values have never been directly measured. In a study published in 2004, David Zachariah used data from Swedish input-output tables that give labor time figures directly. He found a 97% correlation between labor values and the money value of a sector's output. Unlearning Economics doesn't mention Zachariah's study because he seems completely unaware of its existence. But even so, his argument has another flaw. The studies that use wages as a proxy don't just use the upfront wage bill of a sector. What they do is divide the wage bill by the average hourly wage rate to get an approximation of the hours billed in a sector, as Cockshott explained in a blog post from 2019.
The first objection is to say that the Marxists have not demonstrated a correlation between exchange values and labor, but only between wages and exchange value. This, it is argued, is circular. Money quantities are being used to explain value, not quantities of labor. This objection is simply false. Zachariah used Swedish I/O tables that contain data on the number of person years used in each industry there and obtained a correlation of 96.5% between integrated labor contents and market values of industrial output. We used UK I/O tables, which have total wage bills for each industry, along with other statistics on average hourly wages for each industry, to do a similar correlation between hours directly and indirectly used in each industry and market values of outputs, and obtained a 96.4% correlation. So it has been demonstrated that if you start out from actual hours worked, you get a very strong correlation between price and labor value.
But what about the empirical evidence for the labour theory of value? If there's good empirical evidence, then surely there's something to the theory. Paul Cockshott has produced graphs like this. To try and prove the labour theory of value predicts prices in a given economic sector. On the x-axis, we have labour time, measured by millions of full-time equivalent employees in a sector. Time spent labouring should be highly correlated with the value of labour. On the y-axis, we have value added in production, in billions of dollars. Value added is dependent on sales and therefore prices. This seems to show a large correlation between the time spent in labour and the value produced. All hail the labour theory of value. The problem is that a correlation at the level of sectors of the economy does not guarantee values are correlated at the individual level. This is known as the ecological fallacy. Cockshott's error is actually pretty simple. Bichler and Nitzan argue that the correlation can appear just because both a labour value and output are correlated with the size of a given sector. Now, what Cockshott does is compares the total output of a sector to the total value of that output, which he measures in labour time. But both of these are obtained by multiplying price or value by output Q. Now, what this does, multiplying by a common factor, is that it induces a spurious correlation. Cockshott has replied to this, but I think he misses the key takeaway here. It's easy to get a correlation between labour time and value added using examples that do not feature the labour theory of value. There are a variety of historical factors which explain the value added in industries. These factors are likely to be correlated with the various measures of labour value used by people like Cockshott. Remember the tautology of assuming that prices represent values? It's back in statistical form.
Alright, let's unpack this. This section will be kind of messy because when it comes to the empirical literature for the LTV, there are several different arguments and layers of argument deployed by the critics, and Unlearning Economics uses all of them in this section in a rather haphazard way. First, there's the argument that the empirical studies are circular and just correlate prices with prices. Then there's the argument that industry size is a third variable driving the observed correlation between labor time and the money value of a sector's output. And then there's the more general argument that there must be additional variables driving the correlation, even if it isn't industry size, like quote-unquote historical factors. And finally, there's the argument that Marxists have to demonstrate that the correlation between labor values and prices exists on a unit level, rather than just the sectoral level. Marxists have to do this, the argument goes, to prove that the correlation isn't spurious. If we use sectoral correlations, we haven't proven anything, since a correlation between aggregate value and aggregate price can emerge on a sectoral level even though there's no correlation on a unit level. However, before we continue, I need to note something. If you were paying close attention, you might have noticed that there's a contradiction here. Unlearning Economics claims that the empirical studies just use wage bills to proxy labor values and thus are circular. The empirical studies don't measure labor values, he claims. They just correlate prices with prices, and that's why they obtain these high correlations. But simultaneously, Unlearning Economics is claiming that the relationship between prices and labor values has been measured and that there is a strong positive relationship, but that the relationship is spurious. The problem is that these are two different, mutually exclusive criticisms of the empirical studies. Are the empirical studies just exercises in correlating prices with prices, or do they actually find a relationship between prices and labor values, but this relationship is spurious? These are not the same thing. But Unlearning Economics uses both arguments against Cockshott without making a distinction. In any case, I'm going to respond to the second claim, since I already addressed the first. So, Unlearning Economics argues that the correlations obtained in the empirical studies are spurious. He references the ecological fallacy to make his argument, but a much simpler way to describe his argument is correlation does not equal causation. And he presents two versions of the argument: the industry size argument and the historical factors argument. So first, the industry size argument. The argument is that since the labor time employed in an industry and the money value of its output are both correlated with quote-unquote industry size, the correlation between labor values and prices is spurious. Quote-unquote bigger industries employ more people and also have a greater output, and so the correlation between labor time and money values is being driven by industry size. But here's a disarmingly simple question. What is industry size? Just think about it for a moment. Does industry size mean the literal physical space an industry takes up? Does it mean the energy input of an industry? What exactly are we talking about? We can't define size as the labor used in a sector or as the money value of a sector's output, since those are the two variables whose relationship we're assessing. We have to find some other way of defining industry size. Kleeman has suggested that industry size can just be defined as the costs incurred by an industry. control for costs, and the correlation goes away. But the problem is that costs are in fact the mediating variable between labor values and prices. Costs provide the information to capitalists about direct and indirect labor inputs necessary to price their goods accordingly. By controlling for costs, you're eliminating the mediating variable. Bichler and Nitzan have a different approach. They suggest with their spreadsheet that, instead of costs, industry size can just be defined as the number of units of output of an industry. However, there is a way to test the whole notion that size is an independent variable driving everything, irrespective of whether you define size by costs or units of output or something else. Logically, if size is an independent variable driving everything, and there is nothing special about labor, then any input should produce the same spurious correlation. Energy, oil, agriculture. The correlations with aggregate price would be just as strong, because we would expect that bigger industries would also use more energy, oil, food, etc. in the same way that they use more labor. But that is not what we see. In a 2006 study, Zachariah tested other inputs for Sweden and found that other major inputs produce much weaker correlations with price. Cockshott found the same thing for the UK in data for 1998. There's also another method of testing the industry size argument that doesn't rely on correlational analysis. In a 1997 paper, Cockshott and Alan Cottrell tested the coefficient of variation between different production inputs and prices. The idea being that a lower coefficient of variation means less deviation on average between prices and a particular input. Out of all tested inputs, the coefficient of variation was the lowest by far for labor. So all of this is pretty strong evidence that labor is indeed unique and that size isn't driving the correlation. Unlearning Economics is aware that Marxists like Cockshott have responded to the objections of Bichler and Nitzan and Kleeman, and so he retreats to another version of the spurious correlation argument. He says that Cockshott misses the key takeaway, which is not that industry size specifically is driving the correlation, but that any number of unseen variables could be driving it. He suggests that vague, unspecified historical factors are these variables. But at this point, Unlearning Economics is constructing a totally unfalsifiable refutation. You can always suppose that a correlation is spurious. No matter how convincingly researchers make the case that a correlation isn't spurious, you can always insist that it is, and that there's something not being accounted for. If you think a correlation is spurious, you have to specify a measurable variable so that we can test to see if it's really driving the correlation. Just vaguely supposing that these variables must exist is an untestable and vacuous refutation. It's unfalsifiable, which is ironic because Unlearning Economics accuses Marxists of making unfalsifiable claims. There's no magic trick to proving a scientific theory. It's about comparing the performance of different theories and picking which one holds up best. I think what Unlearning Economics is trying to get at is that one can imagine all sorts of explanations other than the LTV for the observed correlations.
Aggregate prices can be correlated with aggregate labor time for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with the LTV.
But this is just a truism. It's not a flaw of the empirical studies. The human mind is very creative and can imagine a practically infinite number of different theories to explain the same data. That's why we subject theories to empirical testing and discard those that are refuted by the data or that can't be tested at all. Something else I want to specify relates to the nature of statistics and interpreting causality. Unlearning Economics seems to think it's possible to prove causality by just using sophisticated statistical techniques. He seems to be knocking on the Marxist studies for using very simple statistics that are unable to prove causality. Now, I don't know what exactly is going on in the economics profession, but it's not possible to definitively prove causality by just using statistics. Like I said, you can always suppose that a correlation is spurious, no matter how strong the evidence is for a causal connection. To establish causality, you always need to combine statistical correlations with theory. If a theory predicts a certain statistical correlation, and that correlation is indeed found, and no additional variables that could be inducing spuriousness are found, then a theory is scientifically supported and should be accepted. And now to the third argument. This spreadsheet by Bichler and Nitzan claims to show that Marxists have to correlate labor values and prices on a unit level to prove the LTV. They argue that if you multiply labor values and prices by a third variable like industry size, then you get a spurious correlation in the aggregate, even though no correlation exists on a unit level. Therefore, correlations on the sector level are too weak to serve as evidence for the LTV. Marxists must provide unit-level correlations. It doesn't have to be industry size inducing the spurious correlation. It could be anything, like historical factors or such. This argument is fundamentally flawed. Firstly, the reason why we don't have unit-level correlations for labor values and prices is really because the data isn't detailed enough. We have to rely on aggregate correlations because it just isn't possible to estimate unit-level correlations given the data we have. But this doesn't actually matter that much. It's not really a problem for Marxist research. For one, providing unit-level correlations would not actually remove the threat of spurious correlation. In an exchange with Cockshott in 2010, Bichler and Nitzan stated,
Cockshott doesn't correlate average unit price with average unit labor time, as revealed by average unit dollar cost with some transformation. Instead, he correlates total sales with total labor values, as revealed by total dollar cost with some transformation. This move from individual commodities to sectoral aggregates introduces the further hazard of spurious correlation.
But Cockshott relying on sectoral aggregates doesn't introduce the hazard of spurious correlation. In principle, this hazard is always there. Again, if you think a correlation is spurious, you have to specify a measurable variable you think is driving the correlation, and conduct tests to see if it's really driving the correlation. But Bichler, Nitzan, and Unlearning Economics don't provide anything of substance. The proposal of industry size falls apart when you test other inputs, and historical factors is ill-defined, so they have nothing. Alright, the transformation problem. The transformation problem has long been seen as a fundamental issue within Marxist economics. Critics of Marxism have long used the transformation problem to attack and discredit the labor theory of value. But before I explain what the transformation problem is, let's let Unlearning Economics try to explain it first.
What is the transformation problem? Well, value itself is not an observable phenomenon. When we work out the maths of the labor theory of value, we get answers in terms of value, rather than in terms of observables like prices, profit, or output. But if we're going to test the theory in the real world, we're going to need things we can actually measure. Transforming immeasurable values into measurable prices is the problem we face. The transformation problem.
Here's the problem with this description of the transformation problem. It's wrong. In fact, It's completely wrong. Marxists have no difficulty with quote-unquote converting labor values into prices. Contrary to what Unlearning Economics claims again here, labor values are in fact measurable, and so showing that labor values are correlated with prices is straightforward. However, converting labor values into prices is not the transformation problem. Unlearning Economics appears to simply not understand what the transformation problem is. Since he cites Wikipedia in this section, let's do the same. Let's see how Wikipedia describes the transformation problem in List of Unsolved Problems in Economics.
The transformation problem is the problem specific to Marxist economics, and not to economics in general, of finding a general rule by which to transform the values of commodities based on socially necessary labor time into the competitive prices of the marketplace. The essential difficulty is how to reconcile profit in the form of surplus value from direct labor inputs and the ratio of direct labor input to capital input that vary widely between commodities, with the tendency toward an average rate of profit on all capital invested.
I italicized that last bit because it's key to understanding what the transformation problem actually is. The transformation problem is about converting labor values into profit rate equalizing prices. The quote-unquote competitive prices described in this article are profit rate equalizing prices. This is going to take some explaining. Beginning with Adam Smith, the classical economists believed that profit rates within capitalist economies equalized across sectors. The labor theory of value predicts that profit rates should be lower in capital-intensive industries, but the classical economists believed something was wrong with this, even though they accepted the LTV. Surely, huge differentials in profitability was not a situation capitalists would tolerate. Adam Smith first advanced the theory of natural prices. Natural prices are the supposedly ideal prices that commodities gravitate toward due to this tendency toward profit rate equalization. Natural prices ensure that profit rates are roughly uniform across sectors. Marx accepted that profit rates equalize. Volume 1 of Capital is based on the simple labor theory of price, but Marx believed this theory was too simple, and he introduced the uniform profit rate assumption in Volume 3. In his writings, Marx called natural prices prices of production, but they're the same concept. However, Marx recognized that there remained the issue of reconciling the LTV with the theory of production prices. The theory of production prices would seem to make labor values irrelevant. Prices would not actually be proportional to labor values, but would rather trend toward magnitudes that bring about profit rate equalization. So it seemed that labor values were not needed to explain prices. And if labor values weren't needed to explain prices, that was a big problem for the LTV. It cast doubt on the entire theory. So there needed to be a way to convert labor values into prices of production, if one wanted to assert the centrality of labor to political economy. This is, or was, the transformation problem. Marx tried to provide a solution in Volume 3 of Capital, but he was unsuccessful. There was over a century of debate on the transformation problem and whether there was a solution. Throughout this whole time, everyone involved in this debate was just assuming that profit rates equalize. From Adam Smith up to the late 20th century, this assumption went unchallenged. But in 1983, Farjan and Magover argued in Laws of Chaos that the uniform profit rate assumption was in fact entirely unjustified. They argued that because of the chaotic and disorderly nature of capitalist competition, profit rates, instead of being represented by a general equalized profit rate, should actually be represented by a gamma distribution. So how did they deduce that? Well, remember that Farjan and Mackover pioneered the econophysics approach. Their argument goes like this. If you imagine gas particles in a closed system, the particles are constantly interacting and exchanging energy in a chaotic and random fashion. Because the total amount of energy in the system is conserved, the gain of one particle is the loss of another. We know through the application of statistical mechanics that as time goes on and the entropy in the system rises, the distribution of energy among the gas particles trends toward a gamma distribution. In mathematical terms, this is comparable to a capitalist economy. In a capitalist economy, there are thousands or millions of firms competing with one another in a highly chaotic and disorderly fashion for profit. Furthermore, the total amount of money in a market economy is conserved in exchange, and so capitalists are competing for a fixed surplus. If capitalist competition is a chaotic means of distributing surplus value among capitalists, then this should mean that profit rates have a gamma distribution. Farjan and Mackover also predicted that more capital-intensive industries should, in fact, have lower profit rates. Subsequent empirical studies have supported their argument. We know empirically now that profit rates don't equalize, and there's good evidence that they have a gamma distribution. Cockshott and Cottrell demonstrated in 2003 that profit rates in the US have wide variation, and that more capital-intensive industries indeed have lower profit rates. Niels Froelich found evidence in 2009 that profit rates in Germany have a gamma distribution. Profit rates do not equalize, and so there's no need to convert labor values into production prices. As such, there is no transformation problem. I also want to address the two Marxist authors Unlearning Economics draws from in this section to support his argument: Andrew Kleeman, who I mentioned earlier, and Ian Steedman. Unlearning Economics makes a brief mention of Kleeman.
Marxists like Andrew Kleeman have agreed on the redundancy of this so-called labor theory of price.
Unlearning Economics talks a little more about Kleeman in a Reddit comment, but from this comment, it still doesn't seem like Unlearning Economics really gets what the transformation problem is. He mentions both in this comment and in his video that Kleeman declared the labor theory of price to be dead, but it doesn't seem like Unlearning Economics really gets what Kleeman meant. Kleeman dismisses the labor theory of price since labor values can't be converted into profit rate equalizing prices. Similarly, Unlearning Economics quotes Ian Steedman. Steedman also rejected the LTV because of the difficulty of reconciling labor values with profit rate equalization. But once again, Unlearning Economics just doesn't seem to understand this, even though Steedman says this in the very quote he picks out. This is how Unlearning Economics characterizes Steedman's argument.
Underlying values mean nothing to capitalists, workers, and consumers. They care about how much actual money they have. Capitalists take their decisions in terms of nominal prices, as in the ones you can see when you go to the shop. They care about the nominal rate of profit, as in the one they report to their shareholders. This inconsistency between values and nominal magnitudes creates a system that's mathematically unsolvable. Steedman shows that we can have an economy as a representation of physical inputs and outputs. With modern mathematics, we can add much more than we saw in our simple example. From this physical representation, we can calculate prices, profits, and output. There is no need to transform things into values.
This is a misunderstanding of what Steedman meant. Steedman was referencing the fact it had been demonstrated that production prices could be deduced without referencing labor values. Steedman considered this fatal to the LTV since he believes in the theory of profit rate equalization. In Steedman's view, the critics had proven that labor values were irrelevant for explaining prices, profits, etc. But this entire argument is based on the idea that profit rates equalize, and we know empirically that they don't. So this entire line of attack against the LTV just doesn't work. Unlearning Economics is citing a totally discredited argument against the LTV without even really understanding what that argument is.
If we assume that only labour creates value, and make the further assumption that capitalists will tend to invest in labour-saving technology, then the volume of capital used in production will increase relative to the volume of labour. Less surplus value means less profit. The rate of profit in a capitalist economy will therefore decline over time. The TRPF is the theme of a video by another left YouTuber, Hakim.
Now, what of the empirical evidence? Well, entire libraries have been written on this topic, but I'll mention a few in passing that you can check out yourself in the further reading section of the pinned comment. Minky Lee, an economist and world system scholar, has researched this globally. Basu and Manolakos have found supporting evidence within the US economy. Several articles looking at the relevant data have found similar trends in the US and UK economy. Similarly, Michael Roberts, too, has found supporting evidence in the UK economy and globally. Finally, Cockshott and Cottrell, too, have contributed immensely to this discussion, and Cockshott himself has a fantastic video regarding the fall of rate of profit here.
Ah, well, if there are 6 studies, I'm going to have to read these, aren't I? For fuck's sake, Hakim. Many of these papers show the rate of profit falling in graphs like this, from Michael Roberts. I decided to investigate this myself using the most readily available dataset. Fred, there are a few different ways of calculating things like profit, capital costs, and labour costs. In this graph, I followed Roberts' suggestion of doing total GDP minus wages as a measure of profit, then dividing that by wages plus capital costs. You can see that there is no noticeable decline in the rate of profit from 1960 until today in the USA. This one tries corporate profits instead of GDP minus wages. This may make more sense because it excludes the government and residential sectors, something advocated by some Marxist authors. Either way, there is no decline. This one doesn't include wages in costs, again something advocated by some authors. Again, no decline. Now, Marx knew that the rate of profit wouldn't always fall. He identified countervailing tendencies. Growing populations, increased exploitation of labour, cheap imports, all could increase the rate of profit, at least in the short term. My concern is that these countervailing tendencies can render the theory unfalsifiable. The best paper cited by Hakim is one by Basu and Manolakos, which partially addresses this very question. They go beyond eyeballing simple graphs of the falling rate of profit by using modern statistical techniques. One thing they do is control for so-called countervailing tendencies. Basu and Manolakos comment that their test is actually the only way to test the TRPF. Without controlling for countervailing tendencies, they say, any test is invalid. This is a big claim because it invalidates every other paper cited by Hakim, something he doesn't seem to note. They find that the rate of profit in the US economy has declined by 0.2% a year, so all the fancy statistical tests seem to confirm the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But this is a very gradual decline, and even the authors call the finding weak in their abstract. Again, not noted by Hakim. Long-term declines after controlling for a lot of important things in the economy just may not be that interesting. And this is just one paper. We need consistent replication to be sure.
Unlearning Economics defines the TRPF in this way.
If we assume that only labor creates value, and make the further assumption that capitalists will tend to invest in labor-saving technology, then the volume of capital used in production will increase relative to the volume of labor. Less surplus value means less profit. The rate of profit in a capitalist economy will therefore decline over time.
So is this an accurate description of the TRPF? Not really. The mechanism driving the TRPF is the accumulation of the capital stock. not labor-saving technology per se. In fact, there doesn't need to be any reduction in the total amount of labor exploited by capitalists for the rate of profit to fall. The rate of profit falls, generally speaking, when the rate of accumulation exceeds the growth rate of the labor force, factoring in other counter tendencies which we'll get to. When we're talking about the accumulation of the capital stock, we're talking about the accumulation of actual physical capital. We're not necessarily talking about new techniques that reduce the labor required to produce commodities, aka rising labor productivity. This is an important distinction because rising labor productivity is actually a counter tendency to the TRPF. Now that might seem contradictory. If the average labor time required to produce commodities is falling, then according to the LTV, prices should also fall. So shouldn't that mean the profit rate also falls? Not necessarily. The thing about rising labor productivity is that it also occurs in the sectors producing capital goods. Rising labor productivity does not exempt capital goods. The TRPF claims that as the organic composition of capital, the ratio of the value of the capital stock to the value of labor power rises across the capitalist economy, the average rate of profit will tend to fall. Rising labor productivity, however, will tend to cheapen the capital stock by reducing the labor content embedded within capital goods. Marx called the cheapening of the capital stock from rising labor productivity moral depreciation. So overall, the rising labor productivity is actually a counter tendency to the TRPF. Marx predicted that the falling profit rate would be a tendency, and that there would be counter tendencies. Unlearning Economics argues that the inclusion of these counter tendencies makes the TRPF unfalsifiable, but this is just nonsense. The counter tendencies to the TRPF are all clearly specified and are measurable, and so the theory is fully testable. Unlearning Economics claims that only one study cited by Hakim incorporates the countervailing tendencies, and that this fact alone renders all the other studies Hakim cites worthless. But this just shows me that Unlearning Economics didn't really do his research. For one, he should have watched this video by Cockshott recommended by Hakim. Cockshott describes a simple model for testing the TRPF that incorporates the countervailing tendencies. In this equation, G is the growth rate of the labor force, T is the rate of technical progress, D is the depreciation rate of the capital stock, and A is the share of profit that is accumulated. What this formula does is compute what the attractor rate of profit should be. It predicts where the rate of profit should tend toward in any given year. Cockshott compared the predictions of the formula to real-world data for numerous economies, and found that the formula was very predictive. Unlearning Economics doesn't address any of this evidence. And now let's tackle these graphs. Why do these graphs produced by Unlearning Economics show no clear evidence for the TRPF? Well, very simply, these are incomplete measurements of the rate of profit. If you want to measure the rate of profit on Fred, you should use net operating surplus. The equation for calculating the rate of profit is S divided by C plus V. S stands for surplus value, C stands for constant capital, aka capital, and V stands for variable capital, aka wages. Net operating surplus is the closest thing to a comprehensive measure of S in Fred. Sources of surplus value like rents and interest payments are included. Divide net operating surplus by compensation of employees and the consumption of fixed capital. This accounts for labor and capital costs. This is what measuring the rate of profit using net operating surplus gets you. There's definitely been a large net decline in the rate of profit according to this measure, with the crash in profitability in the 70s and 80s, and then the recovery due to neoliberalism being very apparent. But in any case, I agree with Unlearning Economics that we shouldn't just be eyeballing graphs. We need to be rigorously testing the TRPF. Even if there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, it doesn't necessarily mean the TRPF as laid out by Marx is responsible. We have to test to see if the rate of profit is really regulated by the variables Marx laid out. Cockshott has provided strong evidence for the TRPF by building a formula incorporating all of the counter tendencies. But it doesn't seem like Unlearning Economics actually read or watched Cockshott's work on this subject, because he claims Cockshott doesn't account for the counter tendencies. He also completely ignores the empirical evidence that more capital-intensive industries are consistently less profitable. He only references this study. This study concludes that there was a slight tendency for the rate of profit to decline in the period from 1948 to 2007. Averaged out, there was a decline of 0.3% per year. Unlearning Economics calls this insignificant and therefore just not that interesting. But he's forgetting something here. The authors didn't conclude that the rate of profit declined only slightly from 1948 to 2007. They concluded that the yearly decline was slight, and that's very different. Small yearly changes add up over long periods. We can see that in this study. In the time period of the study, 59 years elapsed. If we multiply 0.3 by 59, we find that the rate of profit declined by 18% in this period. An 18% decline in 6 decades is very sizable. But nevertheless, Unlearning Economics mentions that the authors called their finding weak, and I actually do agree with that. Although this study does provide evidence for the TRPF, I think the finding is indeed weak. The reason is because their methodology for calculating the rate of profit is flawed. In 2016, Chinese Marxist economist Bin Yu criticized Basu and Manolakos for the way they calculated the rate of profit. He argues that although Basu and Manolakos find evidence for a falling rate of profit, their study is too weak to serve as evidence for the TRPF.
American scholars Basu and Manolakos found weak evidence of a long-term downward trend in the general profit rate for the U.S. economy for the period 1948 to 2007. The profit rate defined by them was much higher than what was defined by Marx. According to Marx's definition, the denominator of the formula to calculate the profit rate should include wages and materials, circulating capital, industrial capital, as well as the role that commercial capital plays in the distribution of profit. Furthermore, fixed capital should be calculated at the same value that the capitalists invested rather than the replacement cost. On the contrary, the loss of the par value and the replacement cost should be deducted from the numerator. Hence, we believe that Basu and Manolakos' study is not strong enough to illustrate Marx's law of falling profit rates.
Now I know all of that sounds rather complicated, but really the criticism here is that the measure used by Basu and Manolakos is overly simplistic. Arguably, this criticism also applies to measuring the rate of profit in the way I did on Fred. Unlearning Economics portrays Basu and Manolakos as the only credible study because of their quote-unquote fancy statistical techniques. But fancy statistics are no substitute for good data. Once again, Cockshott tested the TRPF using a formula that incorporates the counter tendencies, and he matched predictions to the data. This is the strongest test of the TRPF, not Basu and Manolakos. The gold standard in science is prediction, and Cockshott successfully does it with a very simple formula. It's much stronger evidence for the TRPF than Basu, and Manolakos, and the measurement I provided on Fred.